Welcome to the Power Meditation. I'm here with Gopi Krishnaswamy. Welcome, Gopi.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming all the way from Bangalore. So let me tell people just a little bit about you before we dive into our discussion. And I'll just begin by saying the tagline this year for the summit is meditative practices, Dharma teachings, and creative action to transform the world. So, we're going to get to talk about like what is transformation in the world today and what's your view on that. And you have a long background as a mindfulness practitioner, meditator in the Zen tradition, lived for quite some time in monastic settings or in and out of monastic settings at Plum Village for a while, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery. And you are now primarily a coach and mindfulness instructor. You have a studio called Dhyana Wellbeing. We'll provide that link for people in addition to your website, which is just your name, Gopi Krishnaswamy. And you've written a book called, what's it called? Creativity Unleashed. So all about kind of mindfulness and creativity. You've also done a lot of work in the leadership space, specifically trained by the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. And I think you were one of the first Indians trained in that methodology of leadership, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Cool. So why don't you start us out? I'll just, from my personal perspective, what's probably most interesting is your background in Zen, because that's my kind of, my deep roots as a practitioner. So I would just love to hear, what you consider Zen to be and how that influences the work that you do with people.
Sure. Well,
And
thank you.
Also, sorry to cut you off. You could also lead us through a little practice if you feel like it, if you want to just get us grounded.
Sure. In fact, I was just going to suggest that. Thank you for that introduction. And I think perhaps a good way for us to kick things off today might be for all of us to just take a few seconds to, completely arrive. Because many times we're here physically, but our minds might still be somewhere else. So how about we start by simply noticing that we are here, that the body is here, noticing the posture, noticing any tightness or tension in the body, just using your awareness to soften the body. Giving the body permission to relax. Because when the body relaxes, the mind follows. And let's just take a few deep breaths. On the inhale, just allowing the body to expand. And on the exhale, allowing it to relax and soften. One more time, taking a deep inhale and a deep exhale. Just allowing the mind to settle. Just gently resting your awareness on the body and the breath. Simply following the inhale and the exhale. And we could now close the practice with one deep inhale and exhale. And gently and softly opening your eyes and coming back to being here with each other.
Thank you. Nice to settle in like that before we begin.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, here we are. It's beautiful be sharing the space with you, Kelly, and your audience. And thank you once again for having me here. I look forward to talking with you and having some amazing conversation this bright and early morning for me.
Yeah. Yeah, so people are going through so much in the world right now. There's so much change, so much transformation. When we planned this summit, we didn't realize it would be such a volatile time. So maybe you could just give us an idea of how how the ideas of Zen or the practice of Zen supports you and how it might support others who are listening right now.
As you know, if I were to even attempt to uh, define Zen, I would probably not succeed. Um, so I guess I will stay clear of that. But let me maybe share more about what it means to me. And it's interesting for me because I guess for a long time I didn't really know the word, but I only knew a way of being, which later on I discovered was Zen. So when I was growing up, being born to writer, teacher parents, who by the way decided to experiment with me a little bit and therefore didn't send me to school. I was completely homeschooled for a really long time. There was a constant encouragement of, curiosity and questioning and pondering and reflection, rather than being supplied with answers or knowledge, so to speak. Um, so as a child, I was very often, uh, just looking at stuff and asking questions and learning in a very organic sort of way. And somehow, that formed the bedrock for a lot of things that would follow, leaving me open to a sense of wonderment at a lot of things, a sense of curiosity about how things work, and not necessarily in any sort of need or hurry to find the answers. Uh, so later in life, I think I realized that this was something that would shape for me a lot of decisions, a way of living, a way of thinking, um, yeah, a way of just being, actually. And then someone told me, hey, by the way, that sounds something like Zen. Um, so that's really how, I kind of came into Zen. It was not, one of those, stories where I go find a Zen master and then, live with him for a few decades to learn Zen. It wasn't that way. I'm afraid I don't have an interesting story like that.
Well, your own personal experience of stepping into mindfulness in that way is always interesting. So, what did you notice in being at the monastery? Were there any kind of, I mean, obviously you came back from having sat in a monastic setting and you came back and started the Dhyana Wellbeing Center. And was that a real turning point for you, or were you already kind of on the path of focusing on mindfulness as the center of your life?
Hmm. That's a great question you ask, and you know how many times it's only when you sort of look back that you connect the dots and you say, "Huh, oh, is this how it happened?" So likewise for me, um, it all started, I think, when my grandfather, my father's father, kind of walked away from everything and took to a monastic life. I was all of 5 years old when he did that, and he just one fine day he just disappeared from our home, and nobody found him. And then about 2 weeks later, we get a postcard in the mail saying that he had decided to walk away and adopt a monastic life and to not come looking for him. So somewhere in my mind, the memory of him kind of doing this stayed. And I think as I was growing up, I was also kind of questioning what might have led him to that, and inspired him to take quite an extraordinary step like that. Um, so I guess I started kind of experimenting with monastic life in that sense at a very early stage, even without like formally going and living in a monastery or walking away from everything. Um, Traveling with dad, being in India with parents who traveled a lot. I had the opportunity to like visit a lot of temples, monasteries at a very young age. And then at some point, I started carving out time every year for myself for retreats and going and spending time in places with people from whom I could learn. And that's how it all started. And now when I look back, I kind of see that it started. The seeds were sown really long back, and as they slowly sprouted, they started making connections, and that's how it started snowballing in my life. But I mean, more pointedly, it was after one of my retreats at the Plum Village that I got really inspired to start something in an urban setting. So let's say more of an urban monastery, devoid of all the religious strappings, very secular, contemporary. And when I came back, I started looking for a place. And I live in Bangalore, which is in the southern part of India. And it took me about a year to find a little piece of land outside of the city where I said we'd start developing a little monastery. So we haven't been able to launch it because of COVID and all of that, but that's how it started, and hopefully we'll soon have a beautiful place where people can come together to practice mindfulness, yoga, and just a simple way of living.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I know that, given that you have this book around creativity unleashed, and also you work with leadership, it seems like there's this overlap, mindfulness, creativity, leadership, like all of these components are coexisting. Can you tell us a little bit about how those kind of aspects of reality intersect?
It's really interesting that you put it like that because I've in my book as well I speak about how mindfulness is a very close country cousin of creativity and how they're so related. Um, and then again, leadership is pretty much about just exploring your own higher potential. So it seems almost natural that something like mindfulness coexists with creativity and leadership because each of them facilitates the other. And it's not so much of a framework as much as it's just a realization that here are a few things which feed off each other and into each other so much that if you were to explore these areas with an open mind, with curiosity, you just discover that these things are already in you, whether it's mindfulness or creativity or the urge, the natural inclination that life has to expand and push towards, higher actualization.
Mm.
Uh, so that's really how I think of these three areas, and it's more of helping people understand that this is not rocket science. This is not something extremely difficult. This is actually just a question of unwrapping themselves a little bit to allow what is already there to come forth.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like all of those three things are just natural expressions of our true nature when it's not obfuscated by, you know, fear and anxiety and neuroses and
Mm-hmm.
distress and, suffering, in a word, which of course, the whole kind of foundation of Buddhism is that suffering exists, that all conditioned reality includes it. So uncovering true nature then gives us kind of the freedom to experience the mindfulness that is the natural state, the creativity that is the natural state. Leadership feels like it's a bit more of a stretch for people to really understand. I think, especially if they haven't really done a lot of leadership training or what have you, it feels kind of, at least around here, it feels a little bit like a buzzword. It's like, so maybe we should talk a little bit about that. Like, what is leadership? And of course, your training is partially in the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, which came out of Google. And so I guess it'd be good for people to understand what that even means.
Yeah, and you're right. Very often, leadership is something that gets confused with titles, with roles in organizations, and stuff like that. And while that is not completely untrue, that just reflects, I think, one dimension or one part of one aspect of leadership. Uh, I think fundamentally and at a very primary level, we are all leaders, and we come into this world with a responsibility of leadership, uh, with the responsibility to lead our lives in a certain way, to discover our true purpose, to discover our potential, and in that sense, we are here to lead ourselves. And that is, to me, the truest form of leadership. Uh,
Yeah.
what finds manifestation in your professional life is actually a bit of an extension of this. So I would agree completely with you that while there is a tendency to look at leadership from just a professional lens or more from a corporate lens, um, I think to me it's more a journey of self discovery and actualization and reaching one's true potential.
Yeah. Yeah. I often think of it as kind of like in its purest state, it's actually a synonym of actualization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When we're kind of standing in our deepest self, when we're standing in our actualized true nature, then there's a capacity to be kind of in compassionate leadership of all of the different, inner tendencies, all of the different parts of the self kind of are held around center, as opposed to, the way that human experience often is, like ricocheting back and forth between different aspects of self with a whole lot of confusion going on. And of course, it really, in any kind of a organizational setting or corporate setting, it's really pretty vital that the people that are in roles of leadership have some degree of self-actualization. Otherwise, it's just a storm. So you guide people through, I notice that you do a number of different kinds of workshops. Like some are more about creativity, some are more about mindfulness. I imagine you're also training specifically on leadership.
Yes. So essentially, I work in, let's say, the areas of creativity, leadership, and mindfulness with different kind of cross sections. Um, but at the core of what I do is is uh, is transformation,
Mm.
and whether you think of it in the context of leadership or creativity, I use mindfulness. Um, and for me, transformation is not necessarily, going and acquiring something radically new or different. For me, it's about actually making that journey back to who you really are. Because in the first place, all of these qualities that you need for what we call transformation are already within you. And in a sense, I always say that we are like onions. We grow layers as we become older, and these are layers of conditioning. And at some point, when you begin that journey of going back to who you really are, it's a question of peeling off those layers. And when you peel an onion, you cry. There are tears that can flow, and it's a very similar kind of process. You use mindfulness to really peel off the layers of conditioning and the layers of thinking that we have created over time. So that's essentially what I do, whether it's creativity or leadership. I use mindfulness to help people go back to who they really are, and that is transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The peeling the onion metaphor is so common, but the way that you just described it, I've never heard it really described that way, and I've never heard anyone talk about the fact that tears will sometimes come with the process. And it is a very, it can be a very emotional. It can really churn up a lot of emotions to go through an awakening, a transformational process. And as you were speaking about it, it occurred to me that some of the emotion that arises is just like energy that's kind of been trapped for so long in when we've been living kind of inside our avatars as opposed to inside who we most deeply are. But then there's also maybe a quality of grief, like so much kind of like so much time lost or so much inauthenticity or this realization of just, I don't know. So I wonder if you could talk about that, just what it is like for you personally to hold space for people who are, potentially going through a lot of emotional and psychological change while they're in a spiritual process. I'm sure that, we culturally, we, live in such different worlds, and I'm sure it's very different in India. The US is so psychologized, but I'm just curious your perspective.
Right. No, that's a great question, and you have some valuable insights there, which you just mentioned yourself. And yes, I mean, while there can be pain, there can be grief uh, on this journey. Um, I think it's difficult to say in a standard sort of way, how much of this exists. It's different for every person. And in Asian or Eastern philosophy, you also know that, there is a lot of belief and faith in karma, which talks to samskara and, the patterns of uh, thought processes and the mind. And these are not just restricted to the patterns and thought processes of this lifetime, but we all bring in, some patterns from the past as well. As energy bodies, they have continued. So, in a sense, it's almost like when we are born, the basement of the house is already there, and then we arrive at, the ground floor level, and then we start to build from there on. So, it's also a question of becoming aware that we, as we live, are creating, our karma and our samskara and these patterns. And through contemplative practices, including mindfulness, we can become aware um, of pre-existing patterns, the ones which cause us pain. And with this awareness comes the ability to let go. And once that happens, or as that even slowly starts to happen, the sense of space comes in automatically. So it's almost like, you don't have to control, these emotions, which are a little painful. It's almost as if in just acknowledging them, accepting their existence, and embracing them, there is space and there is, gratitude and a sense of openness that comes in, which allows you to recognize that, this is the human condition, and we are not, necessarily superhuman to exist without all of these things. And having all of this in the basement, in your living room and in your bedroom, this is what makes us human. And
Mm.
as this realization comes about, I think, the sort of the melody of your music starts to evolve.
Mm.
So there's no getting rid of pain, or it's about knowing that it's there. It's about working with it, accepting it, embracing it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the real benefits of Zen practice in particular is that we don't necessarily have to believe the stories that the mind is spinning. We just get to, as you said so well, just breathing through it, feeling it, and releasing it. The healing can happen on its own.
Yes, yes. And in a sense, it's about, having a connection with consciousness, with a higher source, if you will. Um, it's also called intellect. Some people refer to it as God, a universal force. There are so many different names for it, but I think it's about retaining that connection with it while the mind operates. The mind is not necessarily always a bad thing. Um, Most of what exists around us has been created by it. I mean, we are talking today virtually, sitting on two opposite sides of the world, and that's been possible to an extent because of the mind. But it's in retaining a connection at the same time with some force that is larger than the mind. I think that's what allows us to bring out the best in the mind.
Mm-hmm,
When
mm-hmm.
the mind let go, by itself can be a bit like a monkey, as we all know. So essentially, for me, the question is, how are you able to retain the connection with, you know, that larger force, yet allow, the mind to function? And when one is able to do that, then the magic actually can unfold.
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly, like when we're in a space of creative unfolding, the mind can be very active, but there's a feeling of flow and of usually like a sense of generosity and trust and abundance that undergirds the activity of the mind, as opposed to, different, more kind of conditioned samskaric energies that where the mind is like, trapped in the loops of anxiety and what have you. So, yeah, having those experiences of being able to cherish the mind when it's in its most spacious state and allow that activity, not, certainly we don't want to, somehow start to subject the mind to some marginalization. The mind has been capable of so much. So, so maybe, I feel like we could go deeper into, I'd love a better understanding of Creativity Unleashed and what that work is about that's in your book.
Sure, sure. And I think what we were just talking about, and you summed up so beautifully, uh, is a perfect segue into talking about what Creativity Unleashed speaks to. Uh, it's interesting that because of my lack of let's say formal education, uh, and the curiosity that came along with it. Um, I somehow always gravitated towards the so-called creative, professions of design and creating stuff. And after having been in that space for a really long time, and at some point, of course, I was also really fortunate to work with one of the most creative companies in the world, a company called IDEO, which you've probably heard of. IDEO is best known for being the guys who designed the first computer mouse for Apple and Steve Jobs.
Mm.
And working with some of the finest creative minds on the planet allowed me to explore how these creative connections are made and how, in a sense, ahas happen, how insights happen. And a deeper exploration led me to understand that it is actually possible to create the conditions for that to happen with more regularity or with extreme, regularity. Um, and in a sense, you almost like develop an ability to tune in to a different frequency. And in my book, I refer to it as, unitive knowledge as opposed to the conceptual knowledge that we are so full of.
Mm.
Through the practices of mindfulness, which, like you said, is basically about, calming the mind down and going beyond the patterns that we are so caught up in. When we're able to tune in, when the mind is at rest, complete peace, calm, we are able to almost like tune into, another frequency, and then boom, a download happens, and that download is the aha or the insight. And so in the book, I explore how historically it's been something that's been recorded consistently, whether it's Einstein coming up with the theory of relativity, or Salvador Dali painting all his famous paintings, or Mozart composing, or even in business situations. History is full of examples of people who had those aha moments in times when the mind was so calm, perhaps even half asleep, and then they get that idea, and then I explore how it happens at what the neurological explanation for it, because these days everyone also wants a little bit of a scientific explanation for it. So I provide that as well. And then we explore a course, a 48-day course, where I advocate mindfulness-based practices for you to be able to find that state of mind almost at will. And hence comes the title. That's when your creativity is unleashed.
Fascinating. So there's a kind of tapping into it, understanding the state, identifying what the factors are that allow you to experience the state more easily, more consistently, and then practices to support. So here's a question for you, and this is related a little bit to the little bit that I know about Search Inside Yourself. So, especially given this time that we're in, which is a time of so much volatility and change, and I think also hope and promise, and this movement toward racial justice and this kind of awakening to not that people haven't known for a very long time about systems of oppression, but there's more motivation right now to address it, more willingness, I think, on the part of people of privilege to address it. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, one of the things that they say in Search Inside Yourself is that mindfulness practices and really true leadership is one of the things that transforms culture. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. So what do you see as possible when people are, have the tools to access their true nature and their creativity in terms of culture change?
That's a great question, Kelly. And I think what somebody like Search Inside Yourself has been able to do is to make what could have been otherwise a sort of niched area or practice more accessible. So mindfulness and contemplative practices have been typically thought of as something meant for monks and for a few people who let's say are into yoga and meditation and stuff like that, but not necessarily mainstream or making the connection with leadership or creativity. And I think that's where Search Inside Yourself is so useful, because of how something so ancient and so powerful has been made so contemporary, easy to understand and easy to access. And even the way it is taught is extremely like secular, contemporary, and very easy to integrate into one's life. So what I personally love about it is that it really talks to my purpose of demystifying meditation and mindfulness. And as I often tell people, you don't have to go to the Himalayas and sit in a cave for a few years and grow a long beard and hair to learn mindfulness, or stand on one leg for a really long time in Vrikshasana. You can actually integrate this into every moment of your life. And when you start to do that, for me, the benefits are phenomenal. Because essentially what we're talking about, whether it's racial discrimination or any other form of discrimination, is nothing but a dysfunctionality of the mind. and the power of these practices to bring the mind back to its underlying state of health is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Because when there is an underlying, sense of good mental health, which is grounded in consciousness, the thoughts that arise from a mind like that will not be unhealthy and will not create disharmony or discrimination, because then we see humanity. We don't see color and creed and race and all of those things, which are what we see today commonly.
Yeah, or we see, we may see color, but we don't see this. We don't buy into the system of stratification that we've been conditioned to accept, this kind of dominator culture that we've been conditioned to accept, that then uses race or sexual orientation or gender or whatever as kind of a tool to maintain the power over kind of dynamic. Yeah. So I hear you. Like when people are tapped into who they most deeply are, they're not interested in anything that is not compassion and equality and trust and truth, and we sure have a long way to go. As we're seeing in the world today. In a sense, you just answered my next question, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. One of the things that I don't actually feel this way, just for the record, but a lot of people have criticized kind of corporate mindfulness, MIC mindfulness, leadership-based secular mindfulness, because of the fact that it's kind of stripped of the roots in the Dharma traditions, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Shaivism, in whatever, that have like really clear moral and ethical standards and guidelines to which all of the practitioners are beholden. So what are your thoughts on that? Even though you just kind of said it.
No, I think that's a very nice way of articulating it. Of course, it's a much larger question. It's a much more complex question, but I like the way you put it in a very simple way. And I'll try to make my answer as simple to start with, and then we can perhaps explore it in more detail. For me, it's very simple, Kelly. If someone's dying of starvation, I'd rather give them, a back and rescue them, or allow them to live or survive and get past that moment, than necessarily insist on giving them the most healthy, sattvic, wholesome meal possible ever, right? So yes, there is criticism around mindfulness and all of that, but hey, why not have a Mac and stay alive and get to a better place? And should you then choose to, have a full spread meal, then so be it. I'd rather this than nothing.
Yeah. So basically you're saying we're dying of starvation as a culture, as a humanity, which...
I'm afraid, yes. I mean, while that can sound a little pessimistic, in an extreme sense, I do think, we starved at times of the human spirit. And I think that could explain a lot of things that we see around us today, whether it's, the state we've brought the planet to, or the state of humanity as it exists today. Perhaps even the pandemic and, things which seemingly are, not the outcome of our behavior in a direct sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, there's that whole, since you brought up the topic of karma, there's also that kind of concept of collective karma, karma that all of humanity shares. And it sure does seem that if not the pandemic itself, then certainly the way that the pandemic has become such a crisis because of the mismanagement of it, that's our collective karma that we all get to be in and feel the pain of and walk through. And we may not have personally caused that, but we get to live it out and, in a sense, accept the karma. It's our moment. You can't reject what life is handing you if you want to be in
Yeah.
relationship with reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And within that, I think there is also a huge opportunity. So all is not pessimistic, and I actually think that whatever is going on right now, whether it's the pandemic or other things, they all present, humanity at one level with an opportunity to realize and discover some things for ourselves. And looking at it a little more deeply, I think even at a personal level, these times have great meaning for each one of us. If only we look at it more closely and we look at it with awareness, there's huge positives in whatever we're going through. That's my firm belief.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that just listening to you speak and slowing down with you, I hope that people are, turned toward that part of themselves that is optimistic, or at least willing to be with things as they are and curious about the transformation of the world. So I just want to appreciate you for your time, for waking up early in India so that I could speak to you late in the evening here, and for all of your work. And we'll make sure that people have all of the URLs associated with you and your work so they can access. I'm sure you do some, at least these days, work online. And if people want to hear more about that, then they can.
Thank you, Kelly. Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm truly grateful to you for the opportunity. I do hope that your work continues to touch many more lives, and I'm glad to have been able to be a small part of it. Very, very grateful. I live for this work, so thank you for giving my voice an opportunity to be heard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, take care.
You too, Kelly. Stay well.